Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki stood in front of the men defending a tiny coral island called Betio, part of Tarawa Atoll, and told them something he apparently believed without reservation. 1,000,000 men could not take this island in 100 years. He was dead within the first day of the invasion. The island fell in 76 hours. This is not a story about American courage alone, though there is plenty of it here. It is a story about two militaries, each convinced their own doctrine was sound, both getting tested at the same time on the same 600 acres of sand, and only one side surviving the lesson. To understand what Shibasaki was so confident about, you have to understand both the man and the doctrine behind him. He was not new to combat when he took command of Betio in July of 1943, arriving already experienced from years of fighting on the Chinese mainland. And he spent the months that followed pushing the island's defenses further than almost any garrison commander in the Pacific had before him. Japanese defensive doctrine at the time was simple, and on paper, brutally effective. Stop the enemy at the water's edge before the first wave ever reached dry sand. Betio was ringed with nearly 500 pillboxes and gun positions. Coconut logs reinforced with steel and coral concrete, giving many of them walls thick enough to shrug off anything but a direct hit. 40 artillery pieces covered the approaches. Nearly 5,000 men, including an elite Japanese naval landing force, defended an island barely the size of a large airport runway. American naval guns opened the invasion by dropping more than 3,000 tons of shells onto the island. A bombardment so heavy that planners genuinely believed nothing could still be alive to resist it. But Betio's sandy soil absorbed much of that force rather than transmitting it, and most of the reinforced positions survived intact. Shibasaki wasn't boasting into thin air. He was describing a defense that had already weathered the heaviest bombardment the United States Navy could throw at it and was still standing. The Americans arrived with a plan of their own, and it very nearly failed just as badly. Naval planners had miscalculated the tide, betting on a normal high water that never came. Only the first 3 waves of Marines rode ashore in armored amphibious tractors capable of crawling straight over the surrounding coral reef. Every wave after that depended on ordinary landing craft that needed far more water beneath them than the reef that day was willing to provide. Boat after boat ran aground hundreds of yards from shore, and roughly 1,500 Marines had to climb out and wade through open water, chest deep in places, directly into the machine gun fire Shibasaki's defense had been built to deliver. For the first several hours, it looked less like the beginning of an American victory and more like the exact outcome Shibasaki had promised his men. Radios flooded with reports of units pinned down at the reef's edge, unable to advance and unable to retreat, exposed the entire distance to shore. A low concrete seawall running along the beach became the only real shelter on the entire island, and Marines who survived the wade in clung to it in growing numbers as the morning wore on. It was not the safety it looked like. Japanese gunners had pre-sighted the wall itself months in advance, meaning the same barrier that stopped rifle fire also marked the exact range every mortar and machine gun on that stretch of beach had already been calibrated to hit. Getting to the wall kept a man alive for the moment. Getting over it into the fortified ground beyond would take most of the next 3 days. Colonel David Shoup was not supposed to be the man in command that day. A staff planning officer for most of his career up to that point, he had graduated DePaul University, joined the Marines for practical reasons more than any burning ambition, and spent years as, in the words of one correspondent who covered him, a squat, red-faced man with a bull neck, known to the men around him as a profane shouter of orders. 10 days before the landing, the officer originally slated to lead the regimental assault was pulled for medical reasons, and Shupe, promoted to colonel almost as an afterthought, was handed command of the entire operation at the last possible moment. He was wounded almost immediately after reaching the reef, shrapnel tearing into his leg from a mortar burst. an injury that would become infected within hours. He refused evacuation. According to men who served under him, at one point, with Marines stalled near the water, he turned on them and asked, in language rougher than any official record usually preserves, whether any of them had the guts to follow a colonel of the Marines. They followed him. For the next 2 days, working through pain and a spreading infection, Shoup commanded every Marine who made it ashore, redirecting units, coordinating what reinforcements could reach the beach, and refusing to be carried off the island, even as the fighting ground on almost without pause. By late in the afternoon of the second day, he had pulled together enough of a coherent line that he was able to send a situation report back to the fleet, consisting of a single blunt sentence. Combat efficiency, it read. We are winning. That night, with the worst of the fighting behind them, he was finally relieved of direct command and evacuated for treatment. He would later be awarded the Medal of Honor, one of only 4 given for the battle, and the only one presented to a man who lived to receive it in person. Shibasaki did not live to see how the battle actually ended. Early in the fighting, in an attempt to relocate his command post across open ground, he was spotted by an American radio operator, one of the only Marines on the island still able to call in naval gunfire at that point in the battle. The shells landed on target. The man who had promised his garrison an unbreakable defense died inside the first day of a fight his own doctrine told him he could not lose. By the time organized resistance ended 76 hours after the first landing craft touched the reef, only 17 of the roughly 4,500 men defending Betio were still alive to be taken prisoner. The 2nd Marine Division paid heavily for it too. More than 1,000 killed and close to 2,300 wounded in 3 days on an island most Americans back home had never heard of. What happened next surprised the Marine Corps almost as much as the battle itself. Time correspondent Robert Sherrod had waded ashore with the Marines and watched the first hours of the landing firsthand. No man who waded ashore that morning, he wrote afterward, would ever forget it. President Roosevelt personally authorized the release of graphic combat photographs, hoping to stiffen public resolve for the fighting still ahead. It backfired, at least at first. A 19-minute documentary built from combat footage shot by Marine cameraman Norman Hatch went on to win an Academy Award. But its unflinching scenes of American dead shocked audiences who had never seen their own war casualties on a movie screen before. Hatch had talked his way into a landing craft commanded by Major Henry Crowe, a cigar-smoking marksman already known across the Corps for his exploits at Guadalcanal. Crowe had no interest in carrying a Hollywood cameraman into combat and told him so bluntly before the boats ever left ship. Hatch convinced him otherwise, insisting he was a Marine before he was ever a photographer and could handle a rifle as well as any man in the boat. Crowe relented on one condition: so long as you keep the hell out of my way. And Hatch spent the next 3 days filming some of the only combat footage of the entire Pacific War to show Japanese and American troops fighting on the same ground in the same frame. Newspapers ran still images of bodies floating in the surf and stacked along the seawall. Letters of protest flooded Admiral Nimitz's desk. General Holland Smith, who had commanded the wider operation, publicly compared the losses to Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, a comparison that did nothing to calm the outcry. The newly appointed Marine Corps Commandant found himself personally reassuring Congress that the cost had been necessary. For a small coral island, most Americans couldn't have found on a map a week earlier, Tarawa very nearly became a political crisis at home before it settled into what military historians would later call the textbook that saved lives on every island invasion that followed it. It would be tempting to end the story there. Enemy doctrine humiliated, American resolve triumphant, and move on. Steel Rain won't do that, because the more honest version of what happened at Tarawa cuts in more than one direction, starting with the boast itself. Historians still argue over exactly how Shibasaki's line made it into the historical record, whether it was written down by a subordinate at the time or relayed afterward by a captured Japanese officer under interrogation. And the exact wording shifts slightly depending on which account you read. No serious historian disputes that the sentiment was real, but the tidy, quotable version of the story is less certain than most retellings let on. The near disaster on the American side is less certain in a different way, and just as real. Marines wading hundreds of yards into direct fire because planners misjudged a tide table was a serious operational failure. One that could easily have turned Tarawa into a strategic catastrophe rather than a costly victory. It became one of the hardest, most argued over lessons the Marine Corps carried into the rest of the war. It also became a genuine argument about strategy at the highest levels of the Pacific Command. General Douglas MacArthur, no admirer of the Central Pacific approach to begin with, pointed to the casualty count on Tarawa as proof the whole island hopping strategy through the Gilberts and Marshalls was the wrong way to reach Japan, and pushed instead for his own preferred route up the coast of New Guinea. Admiral Nimitz held his ground, but the disagreement over whether Tarawa had even been worth fighting for was never fully settled between the two commands, even after the island was secured. And Shibasaki's failure taught the enemy something too. Stopping an invasion at the water's edge, the doctrine he had staked everything on, never worked again after Tarawa. But Japanese commanders studying what had happened on Betio didn't conclude that resistance was futile. They concluded that meeting the Marines at the beach was the mistake. Within a year, at Peleliu, Japanese defenders under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa abandoned the beachline strategy entirely, splitting the island into defended zones built around natural caves and ridgelines, designed not to stop the landing itself, but to bleed the attacking force for every yard it took afterward. The fighting there produced the highest casualty rate of any American amphibious assault of the entire war. Then came Iwo Jima. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi studied Peleliu's example and pushed the same idea further than any Japanese commander had before him, breaking openly with decades of military doctrine that prized meeting an invader at the shoreline as a matter of honor as much as tactics. Kuribayashi ordered his garrison underground almost entirely, honeycombing the island with tunnels and tucked away gun positions meant to let his men fight from cover for weeks rather than die gloriously on an open beach in a single afternoon. Tarawa didn't just cost Japan an island and an admiral who believed his own math. It handed the next generation of defenders a blueprint for making the water's edge irrelevant and the fighting far bloodier than anything Shibasaki had managed. The Marine Corps drew its own lesson from the same 76 hours, and later historians were blunt about what that lesson was worth. Henry Shaw, who would go on to serve as the Marine Corps' own chief historian, put it plainly. Tarawa, he said, provided the Marines and the Navy with the textbook on how to conduct an amphibious landing, and the lessons paid for in blood on that one small island saved far more lives on every assault that followed it. There is a strange symmetry buried in the ships that made that lesson possible. Two of the battleships supporting the invasion, the Tennessee and the Maryland, had themselves been damaged less than 2 years earlier at Pearl Harbor, repaired, and sent back into the same war that had crippled them. This time to help take an island the Navy hoped would open a road back toward Japan. Shoupe carried his own version of that lesson forward. He survived the war, stayed in the Marine Corps, and spent much of the following decade helping refine exactly the kind of amphibious doctrine that had nearly failed under him at Tarawa. He pushed specifically for thicker armor plating on the landing tractors that had saved the first waves and doomed everyone who came in behind them without one, and for far more realistic planning around tides, reefs, and ship-to-shore movement under fire, refusing to let the mistakes that nearly cost him the beach get repeated on the next island. In 1960, 17 years after wading ashore as a colonel with a leg wound he refused to treat, he became the 22nd Commandant of the Marine Corps. Later in life, he became one of the most outspoken senior military critics of the war in Vietnam, once remarking that history seemed to show humanity endlessly throwing small shells against the tide. A position that surprised many who remembered only the man who had once dared stalled Marines to follow him up a fire-swept beach. Admiral Nimitz did not wait for the political fallout to settle before acting. He flew to Betio himself just 2 days after the fighting ended, walked the same beaches where the bodies were still being recovered, and ordered an immediate, exhaustive review of everything that had gone wrong. The next major amphibious assault, on Kwajalein Atoll, barely 2 months later, applied nearly every lesson Tarawa had paid for in blood. Bombardment ran for weeks instead of hours. Armor-piercing shells replaced the ones that had skated off Japanese bunkers without penetrating. Underwater demolition teams scouted the approach beforehand for the first time in the war, precisely so no commander would ever again send Marines wading blind into a reef nobody had actually checked. The results were almost impossible to reconcile with what had happened at Tarawa. American forces killed more than 8,000 Japanese defenders at Kwajalein. Fewer than 400 Americans died taking it. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki told his men that 1 million attackers could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He was answered in 76 hours by a colonel who wasn't supposed to be in command, leading men who had been forced to wade into the exact killing field his defense was built to create, on a landing that very nearly failed for reasons that had nothing to do with Japanese resistance at all. Neither side's doctrine survived contact with Tarawa unchanged. One admiral's confidence became the lesson that made the next islands far harder to take. One colonel's refusal to be carried off a beach became the doctrine that made the next landings survivable. Both lessons came out of the same 76 hours, on the same 600 acres of sand, and neither one was cheap.